Coming up on this week's episode of Bankole's Nation, a tribute to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as we begin our commemoration of the Martin Luther King Jr. annual federal holiday. It's Martin Luther King Jr. week, of course, all week, and next week, perhaps throughout the month of January, there'll be activities dedicated to his legacy and impact. And of course, our tribute here would include a reading from a book that was written decades ago by the great historian, Lerone Bennett, the former legendary editor of Ebony magazine. The book is titled, What Manner of Man? I'm going to read several passages from this book. It is very important that speaks about the leadership, capacity of Dr. King, and why he was a man who met the moment. And of course, this is also the first episode of the year, so the new year is already upon us. It's all coming up on this week's episode of Bankole's Nation. Stay with us. I'm Bankole Thompson. Welcome to Bankole's Nation. I'm your host, Bankole Thompson. Thank you so much for joining us for this week's episode. It is also the first episode of the new year. I want to begin by wishing all of you a happy 2025, a progressive year, a productive year for you. And I hope that all of your goals, wishes, and aspirations and objectives are met this year. Thank you for joining us in 2024. Appreciate all of you for listening to our weekly conversation here. This platform is important for the discussion of issues. In fact, we go beyond just the periphery of the story to dig deeper into the issues that are impacting your community and, of course, our world. And I really want to thank you for not only subscribing to this program, but also sharing with your circle of friends, family members, and throughout the community about the relevance and the significance of having a platform that delves into meaningful issues that are impacting our community. It is Martin Luther King Jr. week, and of course, it's the annual celebration, the annual recognition of the world's premier peace officer, a global champion for civil and human rights, one of the last great liberators of the 20th century, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Every year, January 20th is the national federal holiday for Dr. King. The nation pauses, we all pause to take a look at what King has meant, his work, and his impact. Of course, this year it is also coinciding with the inauguration of Donald Trump as the 47th president. And here on the program, we're going to do some reflection on Dr. King and what he has meant, not only to us who are in the struggle for racial and economic justice, but what he means to the world. Normally, every year during the King holiday, we hear speeches about Dr. King. The I Have a Dream speech is perhaps the most cited speech that is given, which Dr. King gave more than 5 decades ago on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. And we've talked about that speech before. It has been debated. It's not the only speech that King has given. It's not the only consequential speech that King has given. Beyond Vietnam, what is your life's blueprint that he gave in Philadelphia? And there's so many other speeches. There's Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, the Nobel Peace Prize lecture. Dr. King throughout his life was a scholar to the core, an activist to the core, but a man who had demonstrated great intellect and who had a serious commitment to racial and economic justice. So our remembrance of King on this week's episode of Bankole's Nation is going to be a little different. I want to read some passages for you from a writing that was written, a book that was written several years ago. The book is titled, What Manner of Man? What Manner of Man is the title of the book. This book was written by the late Lerone Bennett, who was a student at Morehouse College, the same time that Dr. King was at Morehouse. But Lerone Bennett was a celebrated historian, wrote America Before the Mayflower, Abraham Lincoln's Force into Glory, Abraham Lincoln's White Dream, wrote a lot of books. He was the legendary editor of Ebony magazine for the Johnson publication. He wrote his biography, a noted biography of Dr. King in the 60s, titled What Manner of Man? What Manner of Man, by the late Lerone Bennett, a celebrated historian. And I want to read a passage here from the book in remembrance, recollection of Martin Luther King's impact and his work. And Lerone Bennett writes, he says, no serious student of King's life can help being struck by what can only be called the genius of his unconscious. Like all great men, he seems to have a talent for appearing at the right fork on the right road. It was his good fortune in 1957 to appear on the national scene at a time when lines of forces that had been gathering since his birth were coming to an intersection. Since the early 20s, American Negroes had been gathering fury against their situation, and impersonal socioeconomic forces, urbanization, a developing middle class, the rise of the welfare state, etc., had heightened their hopes and sharpened their sensitivities. Post-war developments, particularly the Supreme Court decision of 1954 and the crumbling of European colonialism, had dangerously increased Negro aspirations. Now, in 1957, in the deepening economic crisis in northern ghettos, Negroes were becoming increasingly restive over mainstream leadership tactics of protest and appeal. And out of this, there began to emerge the feeling nebulous at first, but always waxing clearer, that another line had to be found. A feeling began to creep from Negro to Negro in these years, from ghetto to ghetto, a dawning sense, a fiery hope that things did not have to be that way forever, that some way, somehow, life could be better. For having sensed that hope, long before he knew what to do with it, and long before others could name it, Martin Luther King Jr. earned the right from 1957 on to speak for the Negro and for man. That fact became obvious during the prayer pilgrimage of May 17, 1957, an event and a date that marked King's entry into the field of national Negro leadership. Although King shared the leadership of this event with A. Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins, the NAACP Executive Secretary, it was clear from the crowd's response that King was the man of the hour. It was he who dominated the headlines. It was he who stirred the 35,000 pilgrims who came from 30 states to stand before the Lincoln Monument in the largest civil rights demonstration yet organized. The demonstrators listened patiently and in some cases enthusiastically to a vast array of speakers, including Wilkins, Randolph, and Adam Clayton Powell. But their hearts went out to King. When Randolph introduced King, the crowd came to its feet, waving white handkerchiefs and programs. King, wearing a black robe, looked even younger than his 28 years, stood silent for a moment, staring out over the crowd that pressed at the foot of the memorial steps and flared out in the park on each side. Then, speaking slowly, he launched into his address, buoyed up by the spontaneous chorus of amens that sounded at the end of each silent thrust. In this, his first truly national address, King arraigned both political parties for betraying the cause of justice. The executive department of the government, then headed by Dwight David Eisenhower, was too silent and apathetic, he said, and the legislative branch was, quote, too stagnant and hypocritical. What then did he propose? There was a need, he said, for leadership on four fronts. First, there was a need for strong, aggressive leadership from the federal government. There was a need also for strong leadership from white liberals who were bogged down in a sort of quasi-liberalism based on the principle of looking sympathetically at all sides. Beyond all that, King said there must be strong leadership from the white moderates of the South and strong, courageous, and intelligent leadership from the Negro community, unquote. All of this was sound as the words of the gospel. But toward what end should strong leadership aspire, and with what means? Lerone Bennett writes, King, who had won fame in a direct action attack on public accommodations, chose now, probably for tactical reasons, connected with his emerging with the Negro power structure, to emphasize voter registration in a rhythmically compelling flight of oratory, which immediately established an antiphonal relation between speaker and audience. King shouted, and I quote from Lerone Bennett, "Give us the ballot and we will no longer plead. We will write the proper laws in the books. Give us the ballot and we will fill the legislature with men of goodwill. Give us the ballot and we will get the people judges who love mercy. Give us a ballot and we will quietly, lawfully implement the May 17th, 1954 decision of the Supreme Court. Give us a ballot and we will transform the salient misdeeds of the bloodthirsty mobs into the calculated good deeds of ordinary, orderly citizens," unquote. King went on to speak of the trials of Montgomery, of the bombings and the acts of terror, but he said, quote, "We must never be bitter. If we indulge in hate, the new order will only be the old order," unquote. "We must meet hate with love, physical force with soul force," unquote. He urged the assembled Protestants to go back to their states and to their communities with new determination, remembering always that things would be difficult and that they would be sorely tried. "It is always difficult," King said, to a fervent counterpoint of amens to get out of Egypt. After the prayer pilgrimage, a great many Americans were convinced that King was the man to lead the way. James L. Hicks, editor of the New York Amsterdam News, said King had, quote, "emerged from the prayer pilgrimage to Washington as the number one leader of 16 million Negroes in the United States. At this point in his career, people will follow him anywhere," unquote. Hicks and other journalists and a great many average citizens persisted to King's children in comparing him with Roy Wilkins, usually to the disadvantage of the latter. There followed a series of articles alleging a feud between Wilkins and the new leader. King issued frequent denials and said his approach was a supplement, not a substitute, for the law-oriented NAACP approach. Despite denials, the rumors spread. King finally flew to New York City and ostentatiously took out a life membership in the NAACP. Still, the rumors persisted, fueled not only by man's ancient desire to see other people fighting, but also by deepening disillusionment with the traditional approaches of Negro leadership. The Negro leadership spectrum just then was in a state of considerable confusion, and the energies released by King and Montgomery intensified the strain. As King's star rose, voices within and without the National Urban League and the NAACP called for a new departure and a re-examination of basic premises. Militants within the league formed an ad hoc committee, the Disturbed Committee of the Executive Secretary's Council, to fight for a more daring program. Edwin C. Bill Berry, who later became Executive Secretary of the Chicago Urban League, was chairman of the committee, which contended that the league had played it so safe that we are well behind the safety zone. "This is the last half of the 20th century," Berry said later in an address to the National Urban League. "The age of Sputniks, as well as the age of urban sprawl. Negroes have emerged from 2.5 world wars with a new dimension of personal significance. They are no longer willing to be half slave and half free. They are at war with the status quo and will no longer accept the leadership of any agency or organization that does not know this and will not act on it forthrightly. People who do not mean business, do not walk with Martin Luther King or stand with Daisy Bates. Uncle Tom's day is over, and Uncle Thomas's days are numbered." And of course, Lerone Bennett puts a parenthesis in this book saying Uncle Thomas and Uncle Tom with a college degree and a Brooks Brothers suit. The NAACP was undergoing a similar crisis of purpose. Walter White, the longtime secretary, had died in 1955 and had been succeeded by Roy Wilkins, a former newspaper editor of the Kansas City Call, who joined the organization in 1931. It would be Wilkins' fate to preside over the NAACP in one of the most turbulent periods in its history. He was no sooner settled in his seat than the specter of King appeared on the horizon. Then in trap hammer blows came the rout of litigation in the South and a wave of lynchings and bombings. Finally, and mostly, the South began in 1956 to strike at the roots of the organization, filing suits against Negro lawyers for soliciting civil rights cases and harassing state organizations by subpoenaing their membership list. To make things even more vexing for the Negro leadership class, which was organized around the NAACP and Urban League approaches, Negro activists chose this moment to question its basic postulates. The South and a surprisingly large number of white liberals said the NAACP was going too fast, but voices in the ghettos said the organization was going too slow. James Hicks, the New York editor, said in a celebrated article that neither Walter White nor his successor, Roy Wilkins, was a true Negro leader. Hicks charged that Wilkins was a captive of prominent whites on the NAACP board. Jackie Robinson, a member of the board, did not endorse Hicks's views, but he declared in no uncertain terms that the organization was not reaching the little man. He was particularly disturbed, according to a 1958 interview, about the, quote, failure on the part of the organization to do an effective selling job. What Jackie Robinson and others called for was a more aggressive posture. In the eye of the storm, buffeted by critics of the left and right, sat Roy Wilkins, who was born in 1901 and graduated from the University of Minnesota in 1923. Tall, thin, tactically astute, Wilkins was extremely able in the area he marked off for himself, administrative expertise and lobbying. He had come up through the NAACP bureaucracy and was accordingly a desk-oriented man who lacked Dr. King's charisma and personal magnetism. What was the new secretary's program? Wilkins' program was the NAACP's program, and that program had not changed, really since the days of King's grandfather. Negro interests, he believed, were best served by tactics of litigation and lobbying. He did not then, nor does he now, believe in the use of combat tactics, demonstrations, picketing, boycotting as a primary tactic of struggle. It looks simpler now than it did then. With the aid of hindsight, we can see clearly, Lerone Bennett writes, that events were foreclosing the possibilities of the dominant Negro leadership styles. The grain of history was moving in King's direction, and the Negro leadership class, Wilkins included, would have to move with the grain or lose power to make and shape events. They are deluded who say the despairing rebel. Men have to drink deep draughts of hope before they will throw themselves against the walls of their cage. It was King's achievement to give men hope, and the second indispensable element of a revolt, a new idea. King's significance in this, his first period of national leadership, lay primarily in the direction and momentum he gave to the diffusing gropings of the people. In this season, a deep groundswell of anticipation surged through the Negro masses, and pushing forward met the revolutionary ideas King was shooting downward. By giving the people another ideology, old and yet new, alien and yet indigenous, King gave them a new way of thinking about their condition and a new tool for changing it. Above everything else, King sensed and managed to convey the articulate strata in the Negro community, particularly youth, the revolutionary idea that the explosive force needed for the freeing of Negroes had to be generated within the breast of Negroes. In the years between 1957 and 1960, King's time was spent essentially in two exercises: the staking out of a claim to a new pasture, and number two, the slow striving to catch the eyes and ears of the populace. Though far from clear about either his means or his end, King nevertheless played an immensely important role as a sower of seeds of discontent. Paradoxically, King's main thrust in this period was political. Following his political-oriented plea at the prayer pilgrimage, He attempted to organize a crusade for citizenship, although the Southern Christian Leadership Conference-backed crusade included education and action. The heart of the matter was a drive to register 5 million new Negro voters in the South. As late as December 1959, King and SCLC, with NAACP support and help, were involved in attempts to increase the number of registered voters in the South. Deeply distressed by the increasing militancy of the white resistance movement, King redoubled his efforts to involve the federal government in the Negro struggle. In speeches, interviews, and articles, he hammered away at the theme of government responsibility. In a 2-hour conference with Vice President Richard Nixon on June 13, 1957, he pleaded for executive leadership in what was fast becoming a major domestic problem. King was accompanied to the Washington Conference by Ralph Abernathy. Both men sought assurances that the president or vice president will come to the South to make a major speech on civil rights as a moral as well as a legal problem. King considered the Little Rock integration crisis, which flared soon afterward, as a logical result of the dilatory tactics of the federal government. Asking again for a conference with President Eisenhower, King said, quote, "Little Rock points a dramatic finger from across the country," unquote. On King's initiative, a White House conference was arranged. The conference, which was held on June 23, 1958, was also attended by Randolph Wilkins and Lester Granger, then executive director of the Auburn League. By prearrangement, Randolph served as spokesperson for the group, reading a 9-point proposal agreed upon by the foremost eminent Negro leaders. Quite an interesting book from the passage I just read from Lerone Bennett, the great historian and journalist. And the passage I read shows the mastery of King as not only a leader, but one who is politically astute. And of course, his rise to national prominence. And of course, that also involves the machinations, the political machinations behind the scenes, including other Black leaders of his era who were not happy with his rise, who perhaps, thought it was not his time to rise to the national stage. But what Lerone Bennett sought to do was to show Dr. King as a man who was made for the moment, a man who was ahead of his time. And like I indicated, this biography was written in the 60s. What Manner of Man? And it really shows the extraordinary skills of Martin Luther King Jr. as a negotiator, as an organizer, but also as an intellectual heavyweight and an orator, and one who outnumbered his rivals. And there was no leader in the 50s and the 60s who was better prepared to deal with the challenges of Jim Crow in the ways Dr. King dealt with it than Dr. King himself. And the book, What Manner of Man, speaks to King's own commitment to civil rights, but also speaks to the larger essence of the movement and, of course, King's fierce urgency of now. And the reason why I read from this page is because sometimes I think we are used to hearing different speeches of Dr. King in his own words, and we're going to hear that on Monday, January 28th. We're going to hear that throughout this week, this weekend and next week. In fact, perhaps throughout this month, we'll be hearing much of Dr. King's speeches. But also a different way of looking at King is what others have written about him. And I think it's very important to see what historians have written about King, historians like Lerone Bennett, who was equally committed to the Black struggle, a Black journalist, one of the preeminent, greatest Black journalists of the 20th century, who understood and wrote about the challenges of Blackness, and one who studied Martin Luther King. In fact, this book, the introduction to the book, was written by Benjamin Elijah Mays, the former president of Morehouse College, who mentored both Lerone Bennett and Dr. King when Dr. King was at Morehouse. Dr. Mays wrote the introduction to this book. And in the opening line, he said, both the author and Dr. King are graduates of Morehouse College, were schoolmates, and both received their college degrees from my hand. It is appropriate, therefore, that I write a brief introduction to the book, What Manner of Man, although there was no doubt in my mind that both would succeed in life, being the kind of students they were. I was not wise enough to say to what extent. Both have gone far in exceptionally short time, one as a journalist and author, the other as a Nobel Prize winner and the chief exponent of the doctrine of nonviolence. Both were nurtured in the Morehouse tradition, which says to the students silently and firmly, quote, "You are expected to do well at Morehouse and in the world. Not all Morehouse men do well." So late Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays, former president of Morehouse, wrote the introduction to this book, released in the 60s by Lerone Bennett, who writes powerfully about Martin Luther King's impact. And the challenge for us in this age, the challenge for us in this generation, the challenge for us in this dispensation is to be able to continue that legacy. It's to extend that legacy to succeeding generations, is to confront the vexing issue of economic injustice, is to confront the vexing issue of racial inequality, is to confront police brutality, the unarmed massacre, the massacre of unarmed Black men and women that we see takes place, is to confront challenges in places like Detroit, places like Washington, D.C., New Orleans, other urban centers around the country that have become visible examples of economic inequality, that have become the monuments of economic inequality. These were the themes that informed the civil rights movement. Our memory, our remembrance of Martin Luther King Jr. will amount to nothing if we do not challenge the present day condition of our urban cities, if we do not challenge the present day condition of our communities. The best way to remember Martin Luther King, the best way to remember the man that Lerone Bennett describes as what manner of man, the best way to remember his impact is to be involved in the creative struggle for justice, the creative struggle for economic justice, the creative struggle for racial justice, the struggle to affirm the humanity of Black people, the struggle to affirm the humanity of oppressed communities, the struggle to address the lingering perennial underclass that has become a staple in Black communities, in urban centers, whether it is Flint, Michigan, whether it is Benton Harbor, whether it is Mississippi, Atlanta, Georgia, all around the country. The struggle to address the inequality that we face in this dispensation. And I realize that the annual King holiday is a time sometimes for folks to feel comfortable. Sometimes we listen to the speeches that make us feel comfortable. You know, we like the line in Dr. King's speech where he talks about that he hopes one day his 3 little children will not be judged, 4 little children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. We agree with that. We should be judged by the content of character, not the color of our skin. Race is an artificial construct. We should not be looked upon. The opportunities we get should not be determined by the color of our skin, even though sometimes that's the prevailing wisdom, that's the prevailing condition that we find ourselves in. So we're taken to speeches that make us feel comfortable, speeches that make us feel at home. But we, of course, we're not willing to look at the King, who called for a radical revolution of ideas. In his final book, often referred to as the Last Testament, Where Do We Go From Here, Community or Chaos? King called for a radical revolution of ideas, of culture. Talked about the state of the economy. Talked about a universal basic income. In that book, he indicted white moderates. And of course, Lerone Bennett cites how King felt white moderates were moving too slow. That's right. You know, in that book, Where Do We Go From Here? King talked about white moderates being more consumed with law and order than justice. And that is still going on. So our memory of Martin Luther King Jr., our remembrance of him in this age, our remembrance of his work, his global and international impact should be about making a commitment, making a covenant to advance the cause of justice, making a covenant to continue to engage in the struggle for equity. This year, one of the most prominent campaigns we're going to see is what I call the Anti-DEI campaign, the campaign against diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you have to ask yourself, what would Martin Luther King Jr. say about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Of course, Dr. King would endorse diversity, equity, and inclusion, because the playing field, the economic playing field, has never been equal. Diversity and equity and inclusion simply calling for leveling the economic playing field, giving deserving people from oppressed communities, underserved communities, and Black community an opportunity to excel, an opportunity to advance. But there is a war on diversity. There are folk who are determined to take the nation back to the pre-civil rights era. There are folk who have frowned upon the essence, the very essence of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And some would even try to misuse the interpretation of Dr. King's words against diversity, equity, and inclusion. When King talked about that his 4 little children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of character, he was talking about the persistence of racism, calling for an end to racism. Diversity, equity, and inclusion also calls for an end to racism, because we know the playing field is not equal. We know that Black people are still confined at the bottom of the economic slave ship. The physical chains may have been removed, but the psychological chains still remain. The economic chains still remain. And how do we know? Let's look at the numbers. Let's look at the numbers. Whether it's the Economic Policy Institute numbers about economic growth in the Black community, Black wealth or lack thereof, Black poverty, inequality. Let's look at the numbers. When we look at the numbers, we look at the data, we would realize that the physical chains may have been removed, but the economic chains still remain. So we find ourselves in a long and creative struggle, perhaps in a long walk to freedom. And in order to properly recognize and lift up King's legacy, it will require us to continue to remain engaged in championing issues of justice, equity, and equality. It will require of us to make the case throughout 2025 and beyond that DEI is good for America. That diversity, equity, and inclusion is good for America. It's good for business. It's good for our communities. And we cannot stay silent. We cannot sit on the sidelines in this new battlefield. We have to come prepared. We have to come knowledgeable about these issues. We have to come ready to make the case about why DEI is important in this age. And we should do so in a Kingian fashion. We should do so in the spirit of the civil rights movement. We should do so in the spirit of the movement that asserted the humanity of Black people. The movement that indicated that we are all connected to the same garment of destiny. And at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, during this King holiday, we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice? Are we willing to do what it requires? Are we willing to ensure that our legacy reflects a commitment to the struggle for human dignity, a commitment to the struggle for civil rights, a commitment to the struggle for economic justice? This is not a period where we simply go around citing Martin Luther King's words, reciting speeches, reciting quotes from Dr. King. But we have to take stock. We have to look back and see what the result of our work has been. And what are we doing in this moment and in this space and in this dispensation to address the core issues that are affecting our communities? The greatest tribute, I believe, that we could give to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the greatest tribute we could give to a man Lerone Bennett described as what manner of man in his book, the greatest tribute we could give is to simply pick up from where he stopped. The issue of economic justice. There is no reason why our communities reflect rivers of despondency. There's no reason why our communities reflect economic subjugation. There's no reason why some of our communities are so desolate. Dr. King said at some point we must move from the realm of civil rights into the realm of human rights. And what is happening in some of our communities is just unacceptable. A case in point, the city of Benton Harbor. A case in point, the city of Flint. And there are other cities around the country that you know about that speak to the fierce urgency of now and the need for us to address racial justice now and without delay. Thank you so much for joining us for this week's edition of Bankole's Nation, a reflection on Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy, his impact, and of course my reading of the book What Manner of Man by the late great journalist and historian extraordinaire Lerone Bennett. Now, we'll be back next week with more on this podcast.